Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Hello everybody, welcome to this grammar lesson. By the end of this lesson, you should be able to identify independent clauses, subordinate clauses, how to change an independent clause to a subordinate clause, and what conjunctions make a subordinate clause. Noun or adjective or adverb. Let's get started.
Thanks for joining me to learn about clauses. Be sure to have your notes in front of you to fill in as you go along. A clause is a group of words that has a subject and verb team. There are two kinds of clauses, independent and dependent. Verb teams.
So as you know, a clause is a group of words that has a subject and verb. So whether the sentence or the clause is dependent or independent, you can call it also subordinate. The dependent means it's subordinate. So some books call it subordinate, some books call it dependent, but it's the same. So whether the clause is dependent or independent, it must have a subject and verb. But what makes it dependent or independent?
Independent clause makes sense and is a complete thought all by itself. A dependent clause needs more information to be a complete thought. Here's how it works. The cat is sleeping. This is an independent clause. It has a subject and verb team and makes sense by itself.
It's a clause because it has a subject and verb. But is it dependent or independent? It makes complete meaning, complete sense, so this is independent.
If I add the word when at the beginning, does it still sound complete?
No?
No, it has become a dependent clause because it needs more information. I want to know what happens when the cat is sleeping.
So when we added the conjunction when at the beginning, the subordinate conjunction when at the beginning, the sentence became dependent. Means it's not complete and it needs more information to be complete.
When the cat is sleeping, the mice will play. Now it makes sense.
So an independent clause makes sense. A subordinate clause needs more information and it always begins with a conjunction. So how do I change a subordinate clause to an independent clause? Simply you can drop conjunction that comes at the beginning, or you can add more words at the end to make it complete. Like here, whether a kayak is like a canoe, that is a sentence fragment. It's subordinate because it doesn't make complete sense. If you want to change it to independent, you will drop the conjunction at the beginning and you say a kayak is like a canoe, that's complete. Or you add more words and say I wonder whether a kayak is like a canoe. Now let's start the other part of the lesson, how to identify whether the clause is adjective clause or adverb clause or noun clause.
Alright, so an adjective clause is a subordinate clause that modifies a noun or a pronoun. So if we look at this example, the horror story that has always been my favorite is the black cat. This would definitely be a complex sentence because the main clause, which can totally stand alone, is the horror story is the black cat. Your subject is the story, or horror story, and your verb is. But there's also a subordinate clause in here that has always been my favorite, okay? It starts with that, which is a relative pronoun. Remember, relative pronouns can be subjects too. Has been is my verb phrase, so that's what makes it a subordinate clause, okay? What makes it an adjective clause is that it modifies the horror story. That has always been my favorite, describes this, okay?
So in this sentence here, the main sentence or the independent sentence is this one here. The horror story is the black cat. And in between there is the subordinate clause here. That has been my favorite. This subordinate clause describes the story. It tells you which story Which horror story? So this is an adjective here. So when the subordinate clause begins with a relative pronoun like that and who and which, it's considered adjective. The subordinate clause is an adjective if it begins with a relative pronoun and it describes the noun. It tells you what kind, which one, or what kind, or that's it. An adjective clause describes a noun and it tells you which one or what kind is this noun, which story or what kind of story is it. Here, as you can see here, an adjective clause begins with a relative pronoun, and these are the relative pronouns: that, whom, which, whose, or who, and sometimes when and where. When and where do not refer to the time or place. Now let's move into the second part. Adverb clauses. Adverb clauses. They always begin with a subordinate conjunction like these ones. So if a subordinate clause begins with a subordinate conjunction like one of these ones, it's considered adverb clause. And what does it answer? It answers how something happens, why it does happen, or when or where or to what extent, and so on.
Adverb clauses should do exactly what adverbs do. They modify verbs, adjectives, or other adverbs. These tell when, where, why, to what extent, or to under what condition. Okay? So if we look at this one, I studied hard before I took the test.
See this example? I studied hard before I took the test. The subordinate clause here is this one, before I took the test, because it begins with a subordinate conjunction, and it tells you when did I study hard. I studied hard when? Before I took the test. So when the subordinate clause tells you when or where, when or where or why or to what extent or under what conditions, that subordinate clause is considered adverb.
I studied hard's your main clause, that can totally stand alone, and then your subordinate clause is before I took the test. Okay? Now, before subordinating conjunction, there are a ton of subordinating conjunctions that can be used for adverb clauses. So, like I said, if you go back and look at adjective clauses, there are not many words that can be used to start adjective clauses, but there are a lot that can be used for adverb clauses, okay? So before I took the test, it's a clause because you have I took, subject, verb, and this tells when I actually studied, okay? So this would be an adverb clause, like I said, because it answers when. Let's look at a few more examples. I was happy because I passed the test. Because I passed the test is my subordinate clause, adverb clause. It's
because it tells you here why I was happy. So here, because I passed the test, this is subordinate clause, that is an adverb. The next one is the noun clauses. A noun clause is a subordinate clause that is used as a noun, and it can come as a subject, object of preposition, or a direct object.
And the noun clauses are subordinate clauses that are used as nouns, obviously. Okay. Some different things that we use as nouns are going to be subjects, direct objects, objects of the preposition, predicate nominatives, indirect objects. So it's important to remember those. Farmers often eat homegrown food. Okay. Subject, verb.
In this sentence here, farmers is the subject of this sentence. Often eat, that is a verb. What do they eat? Homegrown food. That's the direct object. So farmers is the noun. If we replace it with a clause, that means this clause is gonna be a noun, and it functions as a subject of the sentence because it tells you who or what this sentence is about. Who is this sentence about, or what is it about? It's about whoever lives on a farm. Let's take another example. The drought affects crops. The subject in this sentence is the drought, and the verb is affects. And what does it affect? The crops. Crops here is direct object. So if we replace this direct object with a clause, That means this clause will be a noun and it functions as a direct object because it receives the action. A drought affects whatever grows outdoors. So what makes a noun clause? It's these conjunctions. These are some of the conjunctions that introduce or come at the beginning of a noun clause, like how, that, what, whatever, when, whether, who and whom and whose and why, and sometimes they function as a subject, object, subject complement, noun. Nouns are often introduced by these words. So, relative pronouns, they introduce adjective clauses, including also when and where. Subordinate conjunctions, these ones, they introduce adverb clauses, and these conjunctions, they introduce noun clauses. And here we come to the end of the lesson. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.